Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, Communicating and Leading at Work. This is one of the many video series that will continue on throughout the quarter, hopefully trying to synthesize some of the learning material as well. I might jump through some of these slides a little bit quicker than usual. My aim is for about 10 minutes. So if you do see me jumping through the slide, I've actually provided you with the slides as well, so you can go ahead and use that. And we'll find that during this process you might come across some images that are a little bit funny, but we'll get into that in a bit. The first idea when we're talking about this notion of communicating is that one of the core sort of competencies that we have as individuals is the ability to communicate, and the skills that we have usually help to dictate whether it is that we are successful or not. We see all the time when it comes to job postings, one of the key competencies that we have is communication skills. We see that from accounting to PR to HR to virtually any other position. Ultimately, if you don't have these effective communication skills, your career may suffer, and we see that in a lot of ways. Sure, you might get the job, but the process that you have going forward might be a little bit more challenging, and it might be met with some resistance as well. So not only is from a very basic level, this is a communication-based course, that makes sense. Not only that, but individuals within leadership roles also have the opportunity to use communication as a tool. And I'll refer to communication as a tool a number of times throughout this class, but communication is a weapon, or it can be used as a weapon if put in the wrong hands, or maybe put into the wrong intentions of individuals. You can lead others with communication. You could also help to enhance the communication competencies and your leadership abilities through communication. You can empower people. But of course, on the flip side of that, we can also use communication adversely, or maybe use it for the wrong purposes. Happen to appear here. So when we talk about communication and making sense and sharing sense, one of the big ideas that human communication from a very basic level is about not only making sense, but it's also about sharing sense, creating meaning, and also the usage of verbal and nonverbal messages. And we'll get into the differences between those as well. But think about it in terms of you and I have, there's sort of this old adage of there are sort of three truths in the world. There is your truth, my truth, and the actual truth. And when we talk about sense making, we talk about communicating, we start to see that unravel a little bit more. So there's a lot of content on this slide. I get that. Take your time. I just want to touch on a couple of different ideas. When we think about the process of communicating, we think about the encoding and the decoding of messages, right? So the code is the actual message itself. So as the sender of this message, I am encoding. I'm thinking about what it is that I want to send and how it is that I want to deliver it. And after I've encoded that, I send it to you, right? You become the receiver of that message. Now, when you get the message, you need to interpret it. You go through the process that we describe as decoding. And as a result of that, you start to hopefully make sense of these different components of communication. Now, the channel itself is something that the means at which the message is actually communicated or expressed to each other. So face-to-face communication, via text, via cell phone, via email. And we know that each of these channels has their own benefits, just as well as they have some of the downsides, which we'll talk about as class progresses. But this idea of noise comes in sort of two forms. It comes in internal and external noise. Internal noise is something that is internal to the communicators. So it could be physiological, like you are tired, you are hungry, like I currently am. And that might impact the communication that I have, because psychologically I'm starting to think, oh man, I'm distracted. There's something else pulling at me internally. But externally is everything from noise. There's your phone going off. There is an ambulance going on outside. There are a lot of people yelling. It's a loud room. So we have internal versus external noise. But ultimately, the success of communication is contingent upon the feedback that is received between the sender and the receiver of the message. So if I send you a text message, for instance, we're talking about channels. I send you a text message and you don't respond to it. Does that mean you did not receive the message? Or does it mean that you have deemed that you don't want to respond to the message, or maybe you don't want to talk to me at all? And ultimately, it has to do with the context, right? The context as to what is the environment. Are we at home? Because we know conversation at home are probably more informal and we're able to talk more openly. We're not worried about offending someone. But it also has to do with the ability to sort of use that context to your benefit when you're in a workplace setting. You might choose a different context than when you are with your friends or when you're at a restaurant versus a movie theater, so on and so forth. So not only do we have the components of communication, we also have this model which looks a little bit like this. As we can probably tell, the two individuals are communicating with each other. I actually really enjoy the poses between the people. We look at the nonverbal cues of the sender and the receiver. And as this sort of transient process occurs, we know that not only are you the sender of a message, but you're also the receiver as you're going back and forth, back and forth. But when we talk about the channels, for instance, we understand that the channels of communication help to dictate whether it is that you're the sender or receiver. Face-to-face, we sort of operate as both. Via email, we might just be the sender. We might just be the receiver. If we decide not to continue that, provide the feedback across the message line, then all of a sudden we aren't going through this transactional process of communication. So let's take a couple of steps back. We understand the components of communication. We see how that might be helpful in a lot of ways. It might be useful. But let's think about this idea of leadership and the ability to theoretically influence each other and influence others. And again, unfortunately, this is a skill and an ability that, and this might be something that you think about moving forward, but are you born a leader, or can you really train someone to be a leader? And a lot of people who make a living off of off of training seminars for leadership might argue that you can create a leader. But the first leadership perspective that we talk about is that leaders in most cases can help make something happen. They're able to create and help to co-create meaning, co-create success within each other. But we also have this idea of leaders being ethical individuals. Now, we can go down a rabbit hole and talk about a number of great leaders throughout the course of history. Castro, Hitler, not ethical leaders, but they use their ability to communicate to make something happen. They help to create extraordinary success, although albeit negative success. And we have to think about it from the idea of what do these perspectives have in common. And ultimately it boils down to the fact that leaders aren't always using their abilities correctly. What we find is that as people are moving throughout their careers from one opportunity to another, they might be using these skills incorrectly. It might have worked at Exxon, but when we moved over to BP, it's starting to perhaps be detrimental to the growth of the different individuals within the company. So as we move on, we think about a leader as an individual versus some of the more role-oriented titles that we have. So a leader is different than a manager in some ways, but we do see, of course, this overlap. We can draw a Venn diagram in a lot of ways. But a manager, when we think about a manager on a very basic level, it's an individual who is appointed to coordinate and facilitate. Their role is to oversee a variety of different outcomes within the organization. Again, organized, they are the individuals who are focused on the short term, although some managers do have some authority when it comes to the long-term success. And ultimately, they coordinate the work without influencing the design of it. They're helping to establish the workflow. We can think about a project manager, an individual who is paid to help ensure that each division, each different individual is able to make success with each other. But we also have this idea of a leader versus a follower. And a follower is someone who actually implements another person's design. They're really engaged in the designated opportunities that they have. What we see is that these terms aren't mutually exclusive. You can be a leader as a manager. You can be a leader, but also sometimes be a follower. Think about the hierarchy of an organization. Steve Jobs was the leader, was the visionary of Apple while he was alive. That's not to say that the people under him were just followers, because the CFO, the COO, the people that reported or interacted with him on that same level probably followed him and also were managers in a way of other people. So I don't want us to get into the situation where we think about a leader as being inherently stronger or containing more power than a follower, but instead we think about the approaches that the leaders have. And the first one is this notion of a trait approach, that As a leader, I'm focused on the psychological and physical attributes that make for an effective leader. And when we're talking about these different individual characteristics, we can think about intelligence, confidence, honesty, competence. They're not afraid to speak up. But going back to an adage that my grandfather instilled when I was much younger, he said, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we could listen twice as much as we speak, or some iteration of that adage. And I think that's an important characteristic because not only is a leader not afraid to speak up, but this individual is also able to listen and take the feedback, the administrative skills, and find a way to implement the ideas of other people. So the trait is really focused on the different attributes, whereas a functional approach is where a leader himself or herself is an individual who is focused on the actual essential functions and tasks of the processes. So we think about the task function, we're trying to make sure that everything gets done. We're focused on the task from probably start to the end cycle, or the process, trying to maintain harmony across the entire project and trying to promote a friendly atmosphere. And you might find yourself, again, in a situation where some jobs might call for you to be a task function leader. Other jobs might have you become process function. And there's not one right way to approach it, but instead sort of playing to your individual skill sets as well. And this idea of a styles approach, that leaders use one of 3 primary leadership skills. We're not saying that you can't have both and that there might be a certain time and place for all of this. But the first one is this authoritarian leader, someone who is the shot caller in a lot of ways. They give orders and they control others. And control might be a negatively connotative word. Controlling others might be helping to put them in positions to succeed. Ultimately, we go into this idea of a democratic leader, someone who is consulting the group for all of its input. We live in a democracy, and so we would like to think that the cabinet, the people that are in charge making decisions, interact with each other for whatever the input is. And then maybe a leader who, if we're thinking about it on a spectrum, authoritarian is very controlling, democratic is sort of dispersing the power with all the people, and laissez-faire is someone who might sort of take a hands-off approach. I don't need to babysit you. I don't need to control you. I trust that you're able to move forward and use all of these abilities that we've instilled on you and that you might have naturally. We do have a couple of other leadership styles, everything from situational, transformational, and servant. Unfortunately, as we talk about these leadership styles, the circumstances are always changing. This is what the situational leader is. I would argue that situational leadership is just good practice leadership. That situational leadership is something that we as individuals should all be aspiring to. Changing our styles, going from a servant leader to an authoritarian leader, might be useful depending on the circumstance and what it calls for us. A transformational leader is focusing on the individuals, the people, and seeing the future of the company and those individuals in new ways. Well, I can be a servant leader and also be transformational. So I don't want us to get too bogged down in the actual terminology we use. Just understand that there are multiple types of leadership styles, more than we've even listed here, that you could talk about and think about moving forward. But how is it that leaders, we understand what leaders are, we understand the communication process and the components, how is it that leaders use communication principles within the workplace, within the water cooler? And ultimately, it boils down to thinking about the principles. What is it that I need to know as a leader? Every day that I come into the office, I need to really, from a very basic level, be aware of communication. And the communication happens in multiple levels. It happens from the motives of ourselves and other people, maybe clients and stakeholders within the organization, but also has to do with the perceived situations and the ability to perceive these situations differently. As a leader, you are given a lot of power. You're given a lot of authority. And your role is really contingent on your ability to, as number 2 suggests, effectively use and interpret verbal messages. We're able to encode the message, package it up, deliver it properly through whatever channel we choose. Not only that, but we're able to decode these messages as well. We're decoding, we're breaking it down sort of piece by piece. And then not only do we focus on the verbal messages themselves, but we also focus on the nonverbal messages too. How is it that I can encode and decode these messages effectively? When I see that your posture is low, your shoulders are dropped, you're refraining from using eye contact with me, what message does that send? Do I see how that impacts the other people within your organization? And if so, what do I do to help you change some of those behaviors? It might be the situation where you don't feel as though you're utilized properly, or maybe you're just upset with your role, or something's happening at home. A leader is able to look at these different cues, not only how you're communicating, what your verbal message is, but also the nonverbal messages. We go into this notion of how is it, not only do we understand the encoding process and decoding process verbally and nonverbally, but how do we listen and respond thoughtfully to other people? We have to think about our role not only as the task-focused leader, but also the people-focused leader. How do we make sure that our messages are being completely and accurately conveyed to other people? And how do we display to them that we're caring? We want them to do well, and we need them for success. And ultimately, how is it that we adapt our messages to other people? Because your role is very much so contingent on your ability to make a decision about the goal that you have in place and communicate about it. And not only that, but when you're communicating about it, tailoring your message to the different people that are receiving it. The CEOs and the stakeholders are very different. The people who are at the bottom of the company. Think about a 5,000 person company. The messages that we're sending to different people when it comes to downsizing the company are probably different. The message that we send to the media to downplay this drop in financial success is probably different. So how do I, as a leader, as a spokesperson, as a representative of this organization, communicate effectively to the right people at the right times? But it really boils down to how is our relationship, our ongoing connection with other people successful? Because we might find throughout the course of time that we as individuals are making a strong connection, but we also have to think about the relationships that we're building, these interpersonal relationships. When you leave the office, when you go to happy hour, when you get invited to a barbecue at Steve's house, whatever it might be, you have this interpersonal relationship, and we have this communication that happens as well. And we also have impersonal relationships and impersonal communication. How do I communicate with you? Are you the janitor? Are you the CFO? How do I as a leader communicate to you that's not demeaning? I don't pick and choose the communication tools and messages that I send to you just because you're lower ranked than me, or just because maybe you were given authority on a project that I want an authority on. We have to think about the roles and responsibilities that we take in place. And ultimately, just a couple of concluding questions to think about when we're talking about leadership. Number one, can we treat all people interpersonally? We think about interpersonal relationships as being friendships in a lot of ways. Can you have a friendship with a coworker and still fire them? Number two, are there times when communicating impersonally is appropriate? When you don't communicate to the janitor or the entry-level intern the same way that you do with a senior manager? And finally, with whom do you normally communicate impersonally with? Do you use this impersonal communication on a day-to-day basis? And if so, what are some of the implications about all of that? But ultimately, I have faith and I trust that you're able to use some of this information in a positive way. So that's all we have for, let's go ahead and mute that. That's all we have for Chapter 1. Hopefully this makes sense when we're talking about the leadership and how it is that we communicate. And so moving forward, again, for the sake of time and detail, let's think about these main components that we've talked about thus far and figure out how it is that we move forward with them in the future. All right, talk to you soon.